Okay, so let's go to the other electronics question like I promised. Okay. Now, I hope you've kind of revised on your registers and all. But I'll tell you what the basic story of this whole thing is. Okay, so basically, we want to store memory. That's the whole idea. Okay. Now, okay, I will just tell you a little thing. Okay, so basically, the first step, what we initially did was we created a cascaded NOT gate. Okay, so if I feed a 1 into this, I end up getting a 0. Okay, that's the input to your NOT gate. And then if I feed a 0 into this, I end up getting a 1. Okay, and I'm taking this output that I got and putting it back to my input. Okay, so these kind of circuits are called sequential circuits. Okay, circuits. Okay, so now this is the basic idea that you use to store memory. Okay, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend this idea, okay, to my latch, to the flip-flop, okay, to the register, all that. Okay, so what is your flip-flop? Okay, your flip-flop is like a 1-bit memory cell, and you take all these flip-flops together and then you build up a register. Okay, so you need to increase the storage capacity and we want to store more things. Okay, so a group of flip-flops together is called your register. Okay, so this is a group of flip-flops. Okay, so now this is a basic idea. Okay, so we want to know, okay, with 100 kilohertz clock frequency, 8 bits can be serially entered into a shift register. Okay, you can enter 8 bits serially into a shift register. Okay, so there are 4 types of registers. Okay, so now here they've told you that it's serially entered. Okay, so the 4 types, I'll just summarize them for you. So these are serial input, serial output, serial input, parallel output. Okay, parallel input, serial output, and parallel input, parallel output. Okay, so these are the 4 types of shift registers that you have. So basically you're feeding your input serially and getting your output serially. So that's what this means. Okay, so now they've told you that you can enter 8 bits serially into a shift register. Now let me show you what the options are. Okay, so these are the different options that you have, and what you're going to realize is all of them are in time. Okay, so the immediate mistake that you would make is probably say, okay, fine, I will take the inverse of this clock frequency and then I would get the answer. Okay, so if I do that, if I do 1 divided by 100 kilohertz, what is going to happen? Okay, if I do 1 divided by 100 kilohertz, I'm going to end up with a 10 microsecond value. Okay, but this is wrong. This is not the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to take into consideration these 8 bits that you've got. Okay, so what do you do now? You want to find out a pulse frequency. Okay, pulse frequency is what you want to find. So you take these 8 bits. Okay, you take your frequency, your clock frequency, and divide it by 8, and then you get your pulse frequency. But that too is not what they've asked for. They've asked for a pulse time or a clock pulse. Okay, these are the terminologies that they've used for registers. If you haven't revised your registers, I suggest you go and look at it today. Okay, so what do you know? That frequency is the inverse of time, right? So you have an 8 divided by 100 kilohertz. This should give you 8 into 10 in the power of minus 5. And that should give you something like about 80 microseconds. Okay, these would be in seconds. This would be in microseconds. So what is your answer? Your answer is B. Okay, so let's just look at the solution. Okay, so all this is a summary so that you can recall what your basic idea is all about. and then we've got about 80 microseconds. Okay, it's called the clock pulse or the clock time. You can't confuse it with your clock frequency. Okay, it's called a pulse. Okay, so you basically it's asking for how much time would I take to input all the 8 bits into the register. Okay, how much time would it take to take in all these 8 bits and put it into the register? That's what they're asking for. Okay, so let's move to the next one. Okay, so I think I've discussed about Poisson brackets in length. Now in this paper, in this 2013 paper, usually the Poisson bracket notation is in square brackets. Okay, this is how they write Poisson bracket notations. But everywhere in this paper, it's given in terms of your simple brackets. Okay, so be a little careful about that. They can make a mistake too. Okay, so let's just ignore the notations for your Poisson bracket now and then just go on to this. Okay, so if x comma h is equal to 0 and y comma h is equal to 0, the value of your h xy is, what is the value of your h xy? Okay, so now I hope you remember this. It's called the Jacobi identity. Even if you don't, you can remember it now. Okay, so what you have here is I want to alternate this. Okay, so you go cyclic. Okay, so this is your Jacobi identity. You take your x here, then you put a y, then you put a h. Then you take your y here, then you put a h and you put an x. Okay, so this is equal to 0. This is called your Jacobi identity. Okay, so now what have you been given? You've been given your x h is 0. And you've been given your y h is 0. So that means this is going to be 0. But if your x h is 0, you also know that this value that you have is basically a minus hx. Okay, recall that your Poisson bracket is anti-commutative. Okay, so you have a negative hx, sorry, and that's also going to be 0. So this value is going to be 0. These two are going to be 0. So what do you have? They've asked you for the value of this, right? So this value is going to be 0, 2. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, what are the values? They've given these so many options. So you realize it's the first option. Okay, this is called your Jacobi identity. Okay, this is how it's usually denoted. Okay, the Poisson brackets are usually denoted like this, but here in this case, in this question, it's given like this. Okay, so these are the same thing as the Jacobi identity, and then you get this, you substitute this and you get a 0. Okay, so this also is a Poisson bracket. Okay, so be a little careful. In the question, they really did not give this comma in between. So you end up thinking that they gave a d by dt of qi_pj. Okay, these are things that you can challenge. Okay, when you see that a question is wrong, you can challenge them, and then you can get grace marks for it. Okay, so many questions weren't challenged, and because of that, they just went ahead with whatever key they put. Okay, so here you have a d by dt of qi_pj. Do you remember what value I told you about the Poisson bracket for q and p last time? So if you have a q and p, you basically get a Poisson bracket of 1. Okay. Now here, what are they given you? They have given you a qi and a pj. Okay. So once you calculate your Poisson bracket for this, you will realize it's going to give you something like delta ij. Okay. So let me say this is q1 and p2. Okay, so when you calculate your Poisson bracket for this, it's going to give you 0. But if it's Q1 and P1, it's going to give you a 1. Okay, so this is basically the definition of your Kronecker delta function. Okay, so what does your Kronecker delta tell you? If you have a delta ij, it's basically equal to 0 if you have I, if you have I not equal to j, and it's going to give you a 1 if your I is equal to j. Okay, so this is what your Kronecker delta tells you. So what can you write here instead of this? So instead of this, you can take this and you can write delta ij. So what do you get? You get a d by dt of delta ij. And that's going to give you a d by dt of what? It's either going to be a 0 or a 1, both of which are constants. So you always end up getting a 0. Okay, so this is your answer, 0. So let's move on and check what the options are. So they've said always 0, always 1. This is to confuse you. Okay, 0 when I not equal to j, 0 when I is equal to j. So you end up you end up thinking that the derivative of a Kronecker delta is going to be a Kronecker delta itself, or things like that. When you do not like actually work it out, you end up thinking stuff like that. Okay, so here you have always 0. So I work the entire thing out again. Okay, so now let's move on to this. This again is a Poisson bracket problem. There have been so many problems in this paper on Poisson brackets. Okay, so let's try and do this now. If the Hamiltonian of a system is h is equal to p squared divided by 2m plus v of q, okay, how do you calculate this value of your Poisson bracket? So you have a p, you've got three functions here. You've got a p, and h. Okay, so basic idea is this thing. What you're supposed to remember is qp is equal to 1. And if you have a pp, it's going to be equal to 0. Okay, both of them are the same. When you calculate you should probably try and calculate this out once and then remember it. Okay, now let's take a p and a h. Okay, what do you end up getting? You get a p, and you get a p squared divided by 2m. I'm going to substitute this value of h, okay, plus v of q. Okay, and then I put another bracket. Okay, so now how do I calculate this out? So let me just do the inner bracket first. Let me just take this part first, and then I'll do, after I solve that, I'll put it back in and then I'll solve it again. Okay, so I got a p squared divided by 2m. I'm just taking this bracket out now, comma v of q. Okay, so you take this out and then you can split this up into two things. Okay, plus a p comma v of q. Now, how can I write this v of q? It's basically a potential, right? So let me say let v of q be equal to a kq, okay, k times q. And this is obviously going to be a 0 because I told you pp is going to give me 0. And even if I separate these two out, it really doesn't matter. It's still going to give me a 0. So let's just put that as 0 and leave it there. And now we have a p comma k times q. Okay. Now, what did I tell you here? Here I told you that qp is equal to 1, right? So I will take this and I will write p comma q. K is a constant, so I can take it out. I will end up getting a k into, this is a pq, this is a qp, okay? So be careful about that. And also I told you that the Poisson bracket is anti-commutative, so I will put a -1 here. Okay, so your pq is -1, your qp is 1. So you end up getting a minus k. Now, what do I have here? So when I calculated this entire section, I ended up getting a minus k. Okay, so this gave me a minus k. Now I need to calculate what is p comma minus k. So that should give me a 0 because this value is a constant, right? So let's calculate that out. So I just erase all of this. And I will move on to the next slide. So is it always 0, always 1, 0 when your I is not equal to j, all that? Same thing again. You get an option A. Okay, so you end up getting 0. So it's always 0. Okay. Now let's look at this. This, be a little careful because there are a couple of partial derivatives in alternate. Also, there is something called your Hamilton's equations of motion involved in it. So you need to remember what the Hamilton's equations of motion are. So I'll just try and recall them for you. Okay, so you have dou h divided by dou qk is equal to pk dot with a negative sign, and dou h divided by dou pk is equal to qk dot. Okay, so these are the Hamilton's equations of motion. So if h is a constant of motion, the value of p comma h, this is your Poisson bracket, is what? Okay, So now let's look at what the options are. You've got a P, you've got a P dot, P double dot minus P double dot. Okay, so now what I need to do here is, okay, I need to, let's say I need to find what df, okay, some function f by dt is. Okay, I need to find out what that is. And then I need to kind of relate this to a Poisson bracket, okay? So what I will end up doing now is your function here that you got, I can write it as a dou f by dou t. And I'm telling you that this f is a function of q, p, and t, okay? So I end up getting dou f divided by dou q into qk dot. Okay, let's just lose the k's here. Okay, I'm just going to write this plus dou f divided by dou p into p dot. Okay, so now what did I have before? I'm going to lose all the subscripts so that it's simpler to understand. So I had a dou h by dou q is equal to minus p, and I had a dou h divided by dou p is equal to a minus, sorry, is equal to a plus q, right? Q dot, whoa, okay, I just erased all that. Okay, let me just write this again. Dou h divided by dou p is equal to q, and dou h divided by dou q is equal to minus p with the dot, okay? And what did I have here? I had a df divided by dt is equal to dou f divided by dou t plus dou f divided by dou p, because I told you f is a function of q, p, and t. Dou f divided by dou p divided by dou p. Okay. Okay, so this is going to be a dou t. Okay, so this is quite understandable. I'm going to like do the same thing for the other one. Okay, so this is basically going to give you a q dot. This is going to give you a p dot. Okay, so now what I can do is I put this negative sign here and I put this here. So I have to replace this with this. So I have a dou f divided by dou t plus dou f divided by, what do you have? You have a dou p into, I've got a dou h divided by dou q with a negative sign here. Okay, so this is a negative sign. Then I have a positive sign. I have a dou f divided by dou q into, what is your q dot? I get a dou h divided by dou p. Now what you realize is this actually gives you a Poisson bracket. So let's just review how a Poisson bracket looks. You have an a, b, right? So you have a dou a divided by dou q, dou b divided by dou p, minus dou a divided by dou p, and dou b divided by dou q. So this is how your Poisson bracket looks. So this is actually a Poisson bracket of your f and h together. Okay, so you have a dou f divided by dou q. Okay, so your a is basically your f, your b is your h. Okay, so you end up having a Poisson bracket. So let's just look at what your df by dt looks right now. Okay, so you have something like this plus an f comma h. Now, if your f is not explicitly dependent on time, okay, there's no explicit time dependence, then I can write your df by dt is equal to f comma h. Okay, so that's basically like writing f dot is equal to f comma h, right? Now what do you have here? You have a p and you have a h. So I can write this as a p dot, right? So now what do I have? I have a function which is a p dot, okay? So now if I take this and I apply the same thing over again, I end up getting a p double dot. So your answer is going to be option C. Okay, so I've worked it out for you again here in the slide. Okay, so this is your total time derivative of your function. Okay, so here I've kind of like included all the coordinates, which I didn't do when I explained about, so that it's easier for you to understand. And then you substitute your Hamilton's equations of motion. You simplify it, you end up getting a Poisson bracket. Now, if it is not explicit, if your F is not explicitly dependent on time, this term goes away. And what do you end up getting? You end up getting a P double dot. So you just do this thing, do the same thing twice, okay? So that you get your answer here. So you end up having option C. Now let's look at this question, okay? Now, here there is kind of like an ambiguity because they've mentioned plasma angular frequency and they've written FC, okay? So that's not your angular frequency. Angular frequency is basically denoted with omega C, okay? So there's a little bit of a problem with the question here, but they've given the linear frequency here. So they've kind of given FC in the options, but they've kind of messed up here. Okay, so let's look at the options now. Okay, so let's look at the options now. These are the options that are given to you. And now whatever you have here, okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so this is how I can represent my electric field when I have a plasma oscillation. Okay, when I have a system which has plasma oscillation, I can represent my electric field in this way. This E refers to your charge, N refers to the density, okay, like how they've kind of mentioned here, okay, so your ion concentration is kind of like N, so this is basically your density or your ion concentration, okay. Now, what do we have here? The movement of electrons under the action of your restoring force F is basically equal to E into Q, E into E. Basically, your E is written in terms of, I mean, like Q is actually E, so okay, so now let's move to this. F is equal to EE. So you substitute your E value onto this. And now what you realize is your F can be written as MC d squared x divided by dt squared. So let's look at this a little more carefully now. Okay, so this is basically the equation that resembles a harmonic oscillator. Okay, so this kind of resembles a harmonic oscillator with some frequency called, let's say, PC. Okay, so your d squared x divided by dt squared minus, you end up having a, let's say, what do you end up having? Okay, so you end up having an E squared n divided by epsilon naught me. Okay, so you take this down here, you have something like that into an x equal to 0. So this is how your harmonic oscillator equation looks. If I put an omega squared here, you realize you kind of like remember it is a system that represents a harmonic oscillator. Okay, so this is how your equation kind of like looks. Now when I compare this is what I'm going to get. I'm going to get an omega PC is equal to root of E squared n divided by epsilon naught me. Now what I have to do is I have to write this omega PC as 2 pi nu PC equal to root of E squared n divided by epsilon naught me. Okay, so once I do that, and if I calculate my nu PC, I will end up getting something like 9 root of n. Okay, so your n here in the question is a capital N, so you just substitute it with that. And then you end up getting 9 root of n. So all these are constants. E square is a constant, epsilon naught is a constant, me is a constant. All of them are constants. So what you can do is you can just substitute them, okay, and then try to calculate FPC. So you realize the problem with the question is that they've asked for angular frequency, omega PC, but they've actually given FPC in the options. So that's the issue with this question, okay. Now let's look at this, okay. So they've said this, okay. The Lorentz condition satisfied by phi. What is your phi? Your phi can also be written as your V. Okay, I think Griffiths, it's V. Okay, in your Griffiths electrodynamics, it's V, and this guy is still A. Okay, so this is your scalar electric potential and magnetic vector potential. Okay, electric scalar potential. Okay. So now let's look at the options that there are. So now this has something interesting to do with, because these are kind of like related to your gauge transformations. Okay, this Lorentz condition is basically a Lorentz gauge. So now what does your gauge transformations do basically? Okay, so your gauge transformations, what do they do? Okay, they call the gauge transformations. There are two types of gauge transformations. One is your Coulomb gauge, and the other one is your Lorentz gauge. Okay, so they're asking for your Lorentz gauge here. Now, what do your gauge transformations basically do? So let's say you have an electric field B, okay, and it's given by some vector potential A, okay, and you are allowed to change this vector potential, let's say some A prime plus alpha, but the condition is that you're still supposed to get B, okay? You can only add something to it such that you get B, okay? Now, I can write this alpha as a gradient, okay? And how can I do that? I'll just quickly go through it for you. Okay, so basically if I can write this, let's say A plus alpha, okay? Okay, and if I take a curl of that, and I'm telling you that is the same as curl of A vector, okay, both of these are going to give me B. The condition that I require to satisfy is this is equal to 0. Okay, so after I simplify this is what I'm going to be getting. Okay, so you'll have to work it out a little bit, and then after you simplify, you end up getting something like this. Now your alpha, because it's a curl of something, you're supposed to be learning these vector identities by heart. Okay, so you take a curl of a gradient of something, let's say something like lambda, and that should give you a 0. So when you have a curl of a vector that gives you 0, you can express that vector as a gradient. Okay, so this is one of the I think these are one of the vector identities that you probably learn in BSc. So refresh all your vector identities and look into that. Okay, so I think the second semester students must have refreshed them already. So let's just move on. Okay, so now if this is the case, I know that I'm supposed to subtract something like, say, a dou L by dou T. Just a minute. Okay, so I know that I'm supposed to subtract something like this from my vector potential. Okay, so vector potential, you have 5. So once you calculate this and work this out, or refresh them, or if you want the notes for them, I can send them to you. Okay, so just that sheet or whatever, like all these technical things, if you want them, I can send them to you. So this is the basic idea of a gauge transformation. What do? They do not, okay, so you're allowed this certain kind of gauge freedom where you can change your phi and your A as long as your vector fields remain the same. As long as your E and B remains the same, you can alter your phi and A. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so what do your gauge transformations mean? You can alter the potentials as long as the fields are not changed. Okay, so this is how your Coulomb gauge looks. Now your Coulomb gauge is not very I think I kind of like the Lorentz gauge better, because they kind of like give you, I don't know if you remember this question that I did in the first class. If you've listened to the lecture, you would probably remember it. There was a last question which said that the Ford-Maxwell equations reduces to 2 when I introduce these scalar and vector potentials. Now, when you introduce a Lorentz gauge, what you end up finding is that your A vector and your V, okay, so the differential equations for those two are exactly the same when you introduce such kind of a situation. So they behave kind of like the same because they have the same differential equations. Okay, so let's look at this. So this is how you can write your Lorentz gauge. Take this to the other side, so you end up getting option A. That's what's given to you in the question. Okay, you have a divergence of A, and then you have 1 divided by c squared d phi by dt. So I think in Griffiths it's given like this. So you all know that your c is basically 1 divided by root of mu naught epsilon naught. So that's that squared. So basically, if I take 1 divided by c squared and substitute it here, I get a 1 divided by c squared dou v divided by dou t. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be getting. Okay, so that's this. Now let's look at this. So this is like standard, you know it right from PU kind of question. So a moving charge can radiate electromagnetic energy if it travels with uniform speed, is accelerated, is at rest, is kept in a magnetic field. So you know that when a charge is accelerated, it kind of radiates electromagnetic fields. So that's basically how your radio antennas kind of work. Okay, so the Maxwell equations tell you that when charges are accelerated, they will give out or generate electromagnetic fields or radiations. Okay, so this is basically how your radio antennas work. And I think I just, like want to discuss about this a little bit. So basically, you have something called a broadcasting antenna, okay? And you have something called your receiving antenna. So what do? Your broadcasting antenna, there are like charges piled up on either side. So you've got a positive set of charges and negative set of charges. And once they start accelerating, they produce electromagnetic radiation. Okay, so then these waves kind of go with a particular kind of frequency. So when they reach your receiving antenna, what's going to happen is they're going to lock onto that frequency, and then you're going to get your whatever data is there in your electromagnetic wave. Okay, so this is basically how your FM, AM, things like that work. Okay, so let's move on to that, to the next one. So this is another interesting thing. I hope you've done this derivation because it's a really nice derivation. It's quite intense, yeah, let me just go forth and like talk about it to you. So an oscillating dipole, I think this should have been an oscillating dipole is equivalent to, okay? So an accelerated charge, a static charge, an electrically neutral system, or a dielectric. So basically, what you have is, let's look at this, okay? So what I'm going to tell you is about something called the Larmor formula, okay? And this Larmor formula basically gives you the power, okay, when you have something called an accelerated charge, okay? The next one that I'm going to talk about is your electric dipole. Electric dipole. And this also gives you some kind of a time average power. So the thing that I tried to do yesterday was I kind of like realized these two formulas look very similar, okay? And the only thing that you have to do is change one to get the other, okay? So now here you have an accelerated charge. So into this condition, if you kind of like want the electric dipole formula, what you're supposed to do is take two charges, okay? That's something like Q naught. When you have a dipole, it's going to be an opposite set of charges, right? So you take these two charges and you take them about 180-degree out of phase, okay? Out of phase. And then you kind of apply it onto this Larmor formula, okay? And then you have to do a little bit of vector addition and things like that. And then you end up getting something called your electric dipole, okay? So let's just look into this. So an oscillating electric dipole is equivalent to an accelerated charge, is what they say. So basically you can get from your accelerated charge formula, your Larmor formula, you will be able to get the time average power for your oscillating electric dipole. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so this is probably the formula that you have done in your second semester. You'd have a power radiated by a point charge called the Larmor formula. Okay, so what you basically have to do is you take your P of t, you basically have it, they consider it to be oscillating with a certain frequency called omega. And then this result can be derived from the Larmor formula by taking two charges and treating it as a separate pair of charges and showing that they are, just a second, and showing that they are about 180-degree out of phase. Again, and using that concept to be actually, and using that into your Larmor formula to be able to get to this. So this is your accelerated charge. This is your electric dipole formula. So what does your retarded potential represent? Okay, so this is the question that you have. Just a second, let me just take out my annotate. Okay, so this is the question that you have. What do you mean by retarded potential? Okay, so I don't know if you've heard of this. They say that looking at a star is basically like looking at your past. Okay, so basically the idea comes from the light that a star gives you right now is light that they emitted in the past. Okay, so it was, I don't know if you've heard, many people keep saying that you're actually looking into your past when you're looking at a star or something like that. Okay, so a retarded potential is basically something that, okay, so let me just show you the options. So okay, so let's look at this. Okay, they say the present value of the potentials to the past position of charge. Okay, so let's just look at the star for a while. Okay, so they say that when you're looking at a star, you're basically looking to your past. Okay, so at this situation, you're saying you're looking into the past. Okay, so basically it means that the present value of the potentials that I'm experiencing, okay, is basically due to a past position of your charge, or basically due to the past position of that star that was there. Okay, so the retarded potentials here, this is option 1. I'm not even reading the rest of the options because it's extremely confusing when you read it all together. So I'm telling you what the answer is and then kind of like looking through it. So the present value of the potentials due to the past position of the charge is called your retarded potential. Okay, so let's look at the others. Okay, so they say past value of the potentials due to the present position of your charge. Okay, so we're looking at right now, what's happening right now because of something that happened in the past. Okay, so let's try to make an example out of this. Okay, so what's happening right now? Okay, because of the COVID thing, we're all kind of like stuck at home, right? So what was the cause of us being at home right now? Okay, it was due to something that happened in the past because of this COVID situation. Now we're all stuck at home. Okay, something that happened in the past and it's currently ongoing too. So it really doesn't make much sense, but it was because of something that happened in the past and because of our past experiences that we're sitting at home. Okay, I don't know if you've heard about this thing that happened called there was a fever that was like really rampant called the Spanish flu or something. Okay, so from there we learned a lot that we need to distance ourselves and things like that. So we took our past experience and applied it to our present position. So maybe you could think about retarded potential like that. Okay, so now let's look at this. The past value of the potentials due to the present position of charge really doesn't make any sense because you're not looking at the past value of the potentials, you're looking at what you're experiencing right now. Okay, now the other ones are the present value of the potential due to the present position of charge. That's like right now, so you don't even have to put up a concept of retarded potentials there. And both of these are in the last option is basically both of them are in the past, so why even bother right now, right? Okay, so this is how you're supposed to remember it. Retarded potential is something right now because of something that happened because of the past. Okay, so couple of things that I'd like to mention about retarded potentials. Okay, so retarded potentials are electromagnetic potentials, the electromagnetic field generated by time-varying electric or charge distributions in the past. Okay, electric or charge distributions that happened in the past. What is the value of the potential right now? Okay, and now what we're looking at is, let's say, okay, so this is what I wanted to talk about. Okay, so you realize that it takes some time, your message has to travel through some particular amount of distance. Okay, and it's traveling at the speed of light. Okay, so you've got an R by C that's coming up. So now your retarded time is basically current time minus your R by C. Okay, so that's your retarded time. And the other thing that I'd like to mention is how the potentials look like. So this looks pretty complicated right now. Okay, when you're looking at these potentials. Now here, what do you mean by this? Okay, so basically your scalar, electric scalar potential is something that's dependent on your rho. Okay, that's your charge density. And your vector potential is something that is a vector itself, and it's called the current density. So you're looking at past position of your charge, right? You're looking at if you look at this, this is basically current time. This is current time. This is your retarded time. This is also your retarded time. So you basically kind of like figure out in the formula that it's the present value of the potentials due to the past position of your charge, or due to the past position of your what is this called? Current density. Okay. So now why are they called that? Because these integrals are evaluated at your retarded time. So you saw that yourself here. Okay. So this is your rho. This is your charge density evaluated at a retarded time TR. This is your current density evaluated at a retarded time TR. So that's why they're called the retarded potentials. Okay. Although they are at the current time, they are because of something that happened in the past. So that's why they call your retarded potential. So let's look at this now. Okay, so this is, they've mentioned TEM wave here. Okay, so TEM is basically transverse electric and magnetic wave. But this problem is actually something that is based on total internal reflection. Okay, basically it's something to do with your critical angle. Okay, so now let's look at this. A TEM wave is incident obliquely on a dielectric boundary with epsilon r1 equal to 2 and epsilon r2 equal to 1. So these, you should realize that when you have an epsilon r, it's basically something like this. It's your relative permittivity. Okay, so you have your epsilon is equal to epsilon naught epsilon r, right? So now let's look at all the options. Okay, so the angle of incidence for total internal reflection is what? Okay, so let's look at all the options now. Now, your critical angle is the smallest angle of incidence that yields total internal reflection. Okay, so let's just start off with that. Okay, and then let's say your light waves are incident from an internal medium with your refractive index n1 to an external medium with your refractive index n2. Okay, so what do you have here? Okay, you have to write this as your critical angle. Your theta c is equal to arc sine n2 divided by n1. Okay, so you have an n2 divided by n1 here. Now, how is your refractive index defined? Refractive index is basically speed of light divided by the velocity of light in that medium. Again, speed of light divided by velocity of light in that medium. Now, your V's get cancelled up and you end up having V1 divided by V2. Now, just listen up a little more carefully. So now, if I have a V prime, say, let's say this is equal to root of epsilon mu something. Okay, so I have epsilon and a mu. Okay, so that's going to be an epsilon naught epsilon r and a mu naught mu r. Now let's forget about this because there are no magnetic interactions here right now. Okay, so let's just forget about your permeability. Okay, you're just looking at permittivity. And now what you basically end up having here is an epsilon naught on top and bottom, which gets cancelled. So you have an epsilon r2 divided by epsilon r1. So you realize that, okay, you kind of realize that these two are the only things that I need. I just need my dielectric constants, okay? Epsilon r, your relative permittivity is also known as your dielectric constants. I just need those two to actually solve this problem. Okay, so what do I end up getting? This was a 2. So I have a 1 divided by root 2. I take a sine inverse of that and I get a 45. Okay, so it's nothing to basically do with the TEM wave. It's just basically total internal reflection ideas. Okay, so now let's move to the next one. Okay, so now this is a question that can be solved in 2 ways. Okay, so I will tell you about the concept of all this transmission line and things like that, and then I will tell you how to do it in a quicker way. Okay, so the capacitance per unit length. Don't forget this, okay? They've said per unit length, okay? So be a little careful about that. The capacitance per unit length and the characteristic impedance of a lossless transmission. Again, remember what is lossless, okay? Lossless transmission are C and Z naught respectively. The velocity of the traveling wave on the transmission line is, okay? So let's look at the options that are given to you. Okay, so let's look at the options that are given to you. Okay, so now what do we have here? Okay, you have something called a transmission line. Okay, so now this is basically your PU. I don't know if you've learned about communication systems. Okay, there was a small chapter on communication systems at your 12th standard textbook. Okay, so this is how your transmission line can be depicted diagrammatically. Okay, so let's just draw a resistance first called an R. Okay, and I've got an inductance here, L. Okay, I've got a capacitance here, and then I got a shunt resistance, and this is how my transmission line looks. Okay, so this is the circuit for my transmission line. Okay, let me just write this as G. Okay, and now how can I write the impedance for this? Okay, so I can write Z0 is equal to root of R plus J omega L divided by G plus J omega C. Okay, so this is how I can write the value of your impedance. Okay, using this, if you reduce the circuit diagram, you've got parallel here, you've got a serial resistance and inductance here. So that's what I'm going to be getting. Okay, now they've said lossless transmission. Okay, so let me just neglect my resistances and put it as 0. G is also equal to 0. So I end up getting something like J omega L divided by J omega C with a root. And these two get cancelled. So I end up getting a Z0 is equal to root of L divided by C. Then there's also another formula that you need to remember. Okay, so you need to find out what the velocity is. So V is equal to 1 divided by root of LC. I need a formula between Z and C. So what am I supposed to eliminate? I'm supposed to eliminate L out. So what I can do is I can just put a Z0 and a root of C is equal to root of L. If I substitute that here, I get a 1 divided by Z0 C. So now this involved basically remembering your circuit diagram, your formulae, all that sorts of things, right? So now what is the easier way to do this? Okay, so the easier way to do this is this. I have got capacitance per unit length given to me. So let me just write capacitance per unit length. I'll just write this as cap. Okay, so now what is your capacitance? How can you simplify? How can you just write your capacitance in simple form? Okay, so I will write Q divided by V. Okay, C is equal to Q divided by V. That's your formula for your capacitance. So that means I get a coulomb here and I end up getting a voltage here. Okay, and this I will simplify into IR. V is equal to IR. So I end up getting a coulomb. I get I. Let me just write this as cap so that I don't confuse it with the coulomb sign. And this is your ohms. Okay, now what is your I? Let's just look at all these simple formulae. Okay, so your I is equal to dq by dt. That means you have a coulomb and you also have a time. Okay, so let's just cut off this coulomb. So basically you end up having a time divided by omega. Okay, so now let's look at this. Okay, so I will substitute this as time divided by your resistance into your L. Okay, now what else do you have? You have a Z0. So what I want is basically I need velocity. Velocity is what? Distance divided by time. Okay, so what I will do is I will multiply this with the C, capacitance, which basically has this. What will I get? I get a time divided by L. And if I take the inverse of that, that should give me the velocity, right? So what do I get? I will get V is equal to 1 divided by inverse of Z0 capacitance, Z0 into your capacitance. So it's basically Z0 C. So this is one way to do it using dimensional analysis. Okay. So this is a quicker way to do it. You do not need to know about your transmission lines. You do not need to know about your impedance value. You do not need to know about the velocity of your traveling wave on the transmission line. So this is much more simpler. Okay, just do it using dimensional analysis. So let's look at this. Okay, so this is how your transmission line basically looks. You've got a resistance R, L, you've got your G, you've got a capacitance. This Z0 is the impedance that you have through this. So this and this are parallel. This is, like in series. Okay, so that is kind of like done. This we've discussed. And the other one, you can do it using dimensional analysis if you have no idea about transmission lines. So let's look at this, okay? The dominant mode in a rectangular waveguide is TE0 because this mode as, okay? So this is a wrong question, okay? They kind of like gave grace marks for this because both the values of your mode are not mentioned here. Okay, so when you're mentioning this, you basically mention TEMN, okay? So basically supposed to have 1, 0 or something like that, okay? But that wasn't mentioned here, so this became a wrong question. Okay, but I'll still explain to you about a little about this. So the dominant mode in a rectangular waveguide, okay, is if they had written this as TE10, okay, then I could say that this is because it has the highest cutoff wavelength. Okay, so let's just look into that a little bit. The dominant mode is determined by the mode having the lowest cutoff frequency, or in this case, where your options were related to your wavelength. So either lowest cutoff frequency or your highest cutoff wavelength. Okay. So below this frequency, there is a total internal reflection in the waveguide. So your operating frequency here must be above the cutoff frequency of the dominant mode. Okay. And below the cutoff frequency of the next higher order mode. Okay. So what do you have here? Basically, if this is your dominant mode, and let's say you have something which is the next order higher mode, okay, the frequency should lie in this region. Okay, so then only will your waveguide work, otherwise it won't work. Okay, so now let's look at this. The waveguide that can support more than one propagation mode, which propagates with a minimum degradation. Okay, that's called the mode with the lowest cutoff frequency. Okay, which propagates with a minimum degradation. That's basically, what does a waveguide do? It kind of like guides your wave, right? So it's trying to like stop all the other noises from coming in, and it's also trying to like propagate it through without any losses of that wave, the information in that way. Okay, so now the designations here are TE10. Okay, so in your syllabus you have a rectangular waveguide. Circular waveguides are not given to you, but probably just stick with rectangular waveguides. Okay, you don't have to go on to circular waveguides. We'll see as time passes. If that's required, I'll explain it to you. Okay, so this is the idea. Now let's just look at this. Okay? So this is basically some kind of a property of your microwave. It's something that's supposed to be remembered. So there's no other way about going about it. There's no tricks here or anything. So the waveguides are mostly used for your microwave signals because they depend only on rectilinear propagation, which applies to microwaves only. Losses are too heavy at other frequencies. They are not excited at lower frequencies. They would be too bulky at lower frequencies. Okay, so this is the answer. This is your option D. Okay, so basically your waveguides are used because they would be too heavier at lower frequencies. Okay, so that's some kind of a property of your microwaves. There's not much explanation on it. So we'll just stop with that for that question. And now let's look at this. Okay, so this is something that I'd really like to explain about. Okay, so they've said the cutoff wavelength for your TE20 mode for a standard rectangular waveguide is. So you must have learned this formula in your second semester. You have omega mn is equal to, you have a c pi root of m divided by a whole squared plus n divided by b whole squared. So these are basically going to give you the mode. Okay, and this formula is something that applies to your rectangular waveguides of width A and breadth B, things like that. Okay. So now let's look at the cutoff frequency first. Okay. Let's look at the cutoff frequency for this TE20 mode. So you can write 20 here, and then you end up getting root of 2 divided by A whole squared. Let's simplify this a little. Okay, so how can I write this omega 20? Okay, so I will write it as 2 pi nu 20. Okay, and I will change it from angular frequency to this, and this is what I end up getting. So I will cancel the 2 and 2, I will cancel the pi and pi. I end up getting nu 20 is equal to c divided by a. Now I need to find out what the wavelength is. So let's look at c is equal to nu lambda. Okay, so this is my wavelength, this is my frequency, this is my speed of light, right? So now I will substitute this nu 20 here. Okay, so c is equal to c divided by a into lambda 20. So let's cancel this out. What do you get your lambda 20 to be? It's A. Okay. So let's look at this. What are the options? So it's going to be option C. Okay. So this is the formula that's given to you. And then this is your cutoff frequency for your TE mode. Okay, so this is the question we talked about, the question, not the previous question, the one before that. Okay, so this is basically your lowest cutoff frequency or your highest cutoff wavelength. Okay, so it's your TE10 mode. Okay, and this is how it looks. You just have to substitute 1 and 0 for M and N. And this is all the other details regarding it. So you can go through it. Okay, all these calculations that we've kind of like done. Okay, so this is the last question. This we kind of like I spoke to my teacher about this, and we kind of like had a debate on this. It's not a debate. I kind of like said it should depend on the spherical symmetry of the potential, and she said it's only supposed to depend on scattering and things like that. Okay, so now okay, so during scattering of a particle by a spherically symmetric potential, the conserved quantities are E only, E squared only, E, Lz, and L squared, Lz only. Okay, so I think you've probably kind of like looked at this in your quantum mechanics class, where you have, okay, basically if you have spherically symmetric potential, what is going to happen is you're going to get these energy eigenvalues, and you're going to get these, what are they called? Just a minute. Yeah, simultaneous eigenstates of your energy and L squared, and simultaneous eigenstates of your energy and Lz. Okay, so I kind of like related it to it becoming a spheric, because you have a spherical potential, you end up getting that. Okay, so that's not the case here. So let's just kind of like go through this in detail. Okay, so your scattering involves incoming free particles and your outgoing free particles. So your incoming free particles basically have a fixed direction, okay, which is usually your z-axis, so that you can solve the problem easier. And your outgoing particles have the same energy and are scattered at different angles. Okay. Now, any free particle in quantum theory is usually explained in terms of your simultaneous eigenstates of your energy and momentum. But here in this case, you have to note that your angular momentum L, okay, which is R cross P here, a free particle is also a conserved quantity, not just your energy eigenstate and momentum, but also your angular momentum. Okay, so the thing is that your momentum and angular momentum, they kind of do not commute. Okay, so you can either choose two things. Okay, you can take your E and L square and Lz rather than just taking E and P. Okay, so in scattered particles, this is what is better, because you end up getting more information about the whole system. So you don't get a complete information about the system, but you want as much information that you can get about the system. Okay, so basically you can do this in two ways. Either you take momentum and energy, okay, or you can do this. You can take L square, Lz, and E. Okay, so this basically depends on what your system, what kind of a system that you're looking at. Okay, so here if you're looking at a scattering system, basically taking your L square, Lz, and E is more preferable. Okay, so another thing, okay, so just remember that even your P and your Lz do not commute. Okay, so only these two, out of these two, your thing has to be picked. Now what I kind of like said was, it should depend upon the scatter. We all know the answer is going to be C. Okay, so the answer doesn't change, but what I kind of like told her was, this teacher of mine, so I kind of like told her it should depend upon the scattering potential as well. But what we realize is that even though I say, okay, fine, the scattering potential is going to like help me get these, you realize that the spherical harmonic functions, your y, l, m, theta, comma, phi, actually appear in these irrespective of the potential. Okay, so irrespective of the potential that you're picking up, whether it's spherical or non-spherical, your y, l, m still appears. So you still get spherical harmonics from here. Okay, so yeah, so that's the last question for today. So I will, I don't think there are anything to be mentioned. Yeah, counters. Please revise your counters because the last electronics question that is pending from the third lecture, I think. I will be doing that tomorrow. And these concepts, please revise them. There's no point just doing it once or listening to it once. So you'll probably have to go down and work them out and make those formula kind of like stay in your head. And reading about TEM would be a really good thing. Like if you could read about TEM and look at all these waveguides and things like that. Also look at your rectangular waveguide. It's a formula that you can very easily remember, and I think a couple of questions come on it. And other thing that I saw was people ask me if repeated questions come for in KSET. So yes, I've seen some repeated questions. They do appear. But I think, moreover, I think what we're doing is actually learning a bit of the concept as we go along. So I think I kind of like saw this question which asked me for the error bounds for your trapezoidal method. Okay, so I think I kind of like discussed the error bounds for your midpoint formula, for your trapezoidal formula, and for your Simpson's formula when we got a question on Simpsons. So basically, when you looked at your trapezoidal formula, you're going to get a H square as your order of error. When you had H cube as your order of error, when you have your midpoint formula, you're going to get a H square. And the last one, you're going to get a H power 4. That's your Simpson's method. So I think when we're discussing this, we're kind of like discussing through the topics in detail. So basically, you're able to like answer all the other questions from that section. So I think that should be pretty fine. Again, I told you about the paper analysis. I'm still working on it. I think I should be able to do it once I finish at least one set of papers, like the 2013 set of papers. So what I realized is still about 2017, they had paper 1 and paper 2. And 2018, they just had one paper, okay? One paper with 100 questions. So the paper 1 and paper 2 basically had like 50 questions and 75 questions. That's how they were going it till about 2017. 2018, they shifted it to just one paper and ended up just giving 100 questions for it. So let's see how things go along. Another thing I told you about is a formula sheet. I'm trying to do it. I'm kind of like trying to like get all this into kind of like a bigger perspective. Like I think I can do that once I kind of like solve all the sets for you, but not right now. Okay, so right now I think you should just stick to the slides and just like just rewatch the lectures and things like that. Another thing that I usually do is when I'm kind of like watching lectures, these things are kind of like going at a very slow pace. Okay, so I wanted to go faster so I can cover a little more stuff. So some of these MIT lectures that I see, I kind of like pace it up a little bit. So if you look at your YouTube option, there's basically like an option where you can like speed up your video so that you can go faster and see it. Some people's lectures are like very, very slow. And so I kind of like do that. So you can go and kind of like choose your playback speed and kind of like speed it up.